European Union Ambassador to the United States since August of 2010. That's all for Washington Journal today. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll now go to the floor of the House of Representatives, which is just getting into session.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., March 1st, 2011. I hereby appoint the Honorable Daniel Webster to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House on January 5, 2011, the Chair now recognizes members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for the morning hour of debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, and each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate go beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleshman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today. I'd like to take this moment to bring your attention to some exciting developments from my hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee. For those of you who haven't heard, Chattanooga has undergone incredible transformation over the past several years. And now the story of our progress is making news across the globe. A few decades ago, Chattanooga's economy was dwindling. Legacy companies were closing. Local manufacturers were folding in the face of global competition. We were even said to have the dirtiest air in America. Today, Chattanooga is a place that has attracted more than $4 billion in new investment during the recent recession. It is a place that has the fastest residential internet in the United States, and Chattanooga is a place that one national publication called the region with the greatest economic potential growth in America. In August, the buzz about Chattanooga brought an economic and social think tank to our city for a first-hand look. The group, called the Intelligent Community Forum, studies 21st century growth within the global community. It looks at cities that are leveraging 21st century infrastructure to create jobs and foster innovation. After spending a few days in Chattanooga, the Intelligent Community Forum confirmed something we've known for a long while. Big things are happening in our community. What the Intelligent Community Forum saw during its trip to Chattanooga and has learned about us since recently led them to name our community as one of the 7 smartest cities in the world. We are now running for the #1 spot. The awards for top designation go to cities that are using information and communications technology to move every sector of the community ahead. These cities are leaders, and are to be counted among them means you're growing in ways that the rest of the world is not. The Intelligent Community Forum is saying that Chattanooga is a place to watch. They see in our community what I want to talk with you about today. The same Chattanooga that once lagged behind the rest of the nation is moving ahead. We're receiving praise from all sides for generating growth in an adverse economy and for maintaining an outstanding of quality life in the process. Chattanooga now offers the fastest residential service in the United States and is one of only a handful of cities in the world that runs at 1,000 megabits per second. And the Electric Power Board, our city's local electric utility, has installed a fiber optic network that uses smart meters to process real-time information and adjust transmissions according to the needs of individual homes. All 170,000 homes in EPB's service area benefit from this technology. But Chattanooga's strides in broadband and digital inclusion are just a part of the picture. Chattanooga was one of the first cities to come out of the recession, thanks in part to its strong business community. Coordinated efforts between nonprofit organizations and small company formation. The Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce runs with one of the largest business incubators with 60 companies employing more than 500 people under one roof. These are just a few examples of the way Chattanooga is setting itself apart from the rest of the world. Every leap we make ahead forward is from the rest of the world. It underscores the forces and the fueling of our progress. Vision and collaboration. These are exactly the qualities the Intelligent Community Forum looks at in a #1 city. I'd like to congratulate Chattanooga for recognitions it's earning, and I hope you'll join me in supporting our quest to become the most intelligent community in 2011. Great things are happening in Chattanooga right now, and Mr. Speaker, a lot more are expected to come. Thank you. I yield.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
Gentleman from California.
Okay, the gentleman from California, Mr. Farr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honor the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps and to the nearly 250,000 people that have served in the Peace Corps in the name of peace. 50 years ago, John F. Kennedy signed the executive order creating the Peace Corps, and the significance of this executive order reverberated around the world. At that moment in our history, America was in the throes of a Cold War, and the international community viewed our great nation with increasing cynicism. Amidst the global tension, the Peace Corps showed the world the enduring values of peace, commitment to national service, and an optimism that had been eclipsed in the Cold War and World War II. Under that masterful direction of Sergeant Shriver, the Peace Corps ranks swelled to 15,000 volunteers in 44 developing countries within the first 5 years of existence. I was one of those early recruits. Right after college, I found myself in Peace Corps training and ended up in a poor barrio in Medellin, Colombia. I saw the grinding cycles of poverty that left so many men, women, and children without hope. I committed then to work to end the culture of poverty. It is in no small part because of that experience in the Peace Corps that I'm standing here today in the well of the United States Congress. Yes, I would be glad to yield.
Mr. Speaker, I'd simply like to join in congratulating my friend for his extraordinary service in the Peace Corps. He not only served at that time, but he continues to share that experience with us today, and as we focus on countries that are dealing with difficulty all around the world, the expansion of the Peace Corps is something that has been very important, and recognizing the 50th anniversary is something that I'm happy to join my colleague in doing, and I thank my friend for yielding.
Thank you, Mr. Dreyer, and I appreciate your support as well. Over the past 50 years, through war and conflict, the Peace Corps has shown the world a hopeful, uplifting side of America that reflects our fundamental ideas of peace, service, and grassroots development. And that great legacy continues today. At this moment, 865,000 volunteers are serving in 76 developing countries around the world. I'm proud to say that 25 of those volunteers are from my district. Among them is Gabe LaHoo, who was a valedictorian at Aptos High School. He then went on to study plant sciences at Cornell. Just 4 months after graduating summa cum laude from college, Gabe entered into the Peace Corps in Paraguay to serve in an agricultural role there. Right now, Gabe is working shoulder to shoulder with community members in eastern Paraguay on rural agricultural development. And like many Peace Corps volunteers, Gabe's service ripples out beyond one single project. He also helps start a composting initiative, teaches English, and is working to set a library up and get running. And there are others, like Ashley Burke from Marina, who is teaching English in an orphanage in Rwanda. James Staples from Pacific Grove, who is working on sustainable rural tourism in Guatemala. Gabe, Ashley, and James are powerful ambassadors who have committed 2 years of their lives to serving America's best values abroad. And the American taxpayers reap a huge return on their investment in this remarkable program. To date, more than 20 countries have requested Peace Corps volunteers, and other countries want to increase the number of volunteers allocated to them. The Peace Corps is able to build this goodwill on a shoestring budget. Dollar for dollar, Peace Corps volunteers are the most cost-effective ambassadors of international development and diplomacy. In fact, Peace Corps amounts to roughly 1% of the total federal budget. For the cost of sending one soldier to Afghanistan, the Peace Corps can send 13 volunteers to developing countries to serve U.S. interests in the name of peace. In the midst of our tight budget climate, the Peace Corps is one of the most low-cost, high-return tools in our foreign policy box. In honor of the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps, I am proud to join my fellow returned Peace Corps volunteers, Tom Petri, Mike Honda, and John Garamendi, all members of Congress, to introduce a bipartisan bill to establish a commemorative work in the District of Columbia to recognize the founding of the Peace Corps at no expense to the U.S. taxpayer. This bill, which passed the House by voice vote last Congress, commemorates the creation of a unique form of public service that promotes peace through people-to-people diplomacy and cross-cultural understanding. It doesn't cost the taxpayers a single penny. I urge my congressional colleagues to honor America's commitment to peace by supporting the swift passage of this timely legislation. So today, as we mark this significant milestone in America's history, I urge each of you to join me in honoring your constituents who have served in and are supporting the Peace Corps, supporting the Peace Corps funding, so that we can usher in the next generation of Americans who want to serve this country in the name of peace. Thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, currently U.S. families spend about $1 billion per day on imported oil. We import about 1.6 billion barrels from politically unstable nations with corresponding instability in prices, which influence our dollars, our economy, and sometimes our soldiers having to look at defending these areas. Now, we are currently losing 220,000 barrels per day in domestic production because the administration's moratorium on Gulf of Mexico oil rigs. This also means the government is losing almost $1.4 billion in revenue that we so sorely need. Keep in mind that each 1 cent increase in gasoline prices costs American families $1 billion per year. That's money that's not going into our economy because 60% of our oil comes from foreign countries. It's money that's going into other economies. Now, while this moratorium is taking place, at least 12 rigs have already departed from the Gulf, some not to return, as they move these rigs, which can cost $1 million a day to operate, as they move them to other countries. 4 more are considering leaving. That's 6,000 jobs in jeopardy. Currently, more than 30 drilling rigs in the Gulf of Mexico are idle. Now, even though the administration is now allowing just 1 of those rigs to move forward with exploration, all the rest is still off limits with something of a permitorium as they're looking at their permits all over again. That's why I introduced yesterday the Safe Exploration Coming from Underwater Reserves of Energy Act, or the SECURE Act. This bill allows all of those Gulf of Mexico drilling permits which have already been approved by regulators to move safely forward. Keep in mind, all of these have been reviewed thoroughly. It takes a lot of time to do that. And they all follow strict regulations. There's no shortcuts on safety. There's no bypassing environmental regulations. And quite frankly, I trust our environmental regulations to protect the environment more so than other countries. What we have from the lost production of the domestic oil industry means we are increasingly dependent on those unstable foreign regimes to meet our needs. And it puts our economy at risk should another spike in oil prices occur like the one we have now. Add to this and punctuate this with the recent unrest in Libya, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and whatever country may come next, and helps point out a lot of our vulnerability. The vulnerability of what happens if the Suez Canal is closed down even for a short period of time. The vulnerability that comes if Libyan oil production declines. The vulnerability that comes with Iran and its use of oil revenue to put pressure on other nations to support their efforts to develop nuclear weapons, their threats to Israel, and their threats to dominate the Mideast. The cost of an arms race in the Mideast, an arms race in the world with new nuclear weapons, far surpasses anything we can imagine in the costs of what we need to be doing with the revenues we can get from oil. So I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill, the Secure Act, so we can secure our own energy future. We can lower gas prices. We can create thousands of jobs right here at home, from drilling on these rigs, from developing the pipe, from building the rigs, from so many other supply chains of what we have in this nation to do this. And above all, we keep our domestic oil at home rather than paying our own dollars to go to other nations. We can drill for our oil and our own jobs, and we can boost our own economy. Or we can continue to be dependent on unstable nations, rising prices, and sadly paying for both sides of the war on terror. It is a sobering thought to think for Americans that every time they go to put gasoline in their tank that they are funding both sides of the war on terror. That alone should be enough to make us change our approach. That alone should be enough to say let's use our oil and our resources instead of propping up the economy of other nations. That alone should be something that motivates us to make sure we're working on these issues. And hopefully that means we can melt this moratorium on our own domestic oil production. The choice is ours, and I hope all my colleagues will choose to support the United States of America jobs as opposed to those dollars just going to other countries. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio. Tennessee. Oh, wait, no. Tennessee, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Speaker.
You're recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By recklessly slashing more than $60 billion from the budget, the Republican majority is trying to assume the mantle of fiscal responsibility. Yes, fiscal. Sometimes we in politics have problems with pronunciations, and sometimes we have problems with concepts. There are two fiscals. There's the fiscal dealing with dollars, F-I-S-C-A-L, and there's the physical, P-H-Y-C-I-S-I-C-A-L. They're trying to assume the mantle of fiscal responsibility. Within the $60 billion, there are certainly some cuts that should be made that would be cost effective, and there are other cuts that weren't made in the Defense Department, farm subsidies, and other places that weren't made but should have been made. Many of the programs that were cut or severely underfunded are programs that have a significant financial return. In fact, many of these underfunded or eliminated programs actually save the government far more money than they cost. Penny wise and pound foolish. So the Republican claims that they are saving the federal government more than $60 billion is simply untrue. Yes, they are eliminating $60 billion from the budget, but in reality they are increasing the deficit in other areas that do not appear in the budget, certainly not this year. As Paul Krugman would say, eat the future or lose the future. They're not concerned about the future. It's about today, and if it's the future, it's the 2012 election. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the Republican so-called budget hawks fail to look at this holistically. The only costs they see are numbers on a page that they want to hold up as talking points. This slide shows some of the cuts. Food and Drug Administration received funding by $241 million below 2010 and $400 million below the administration's 2011 budget request. That's the Food and Drug Administration. Remember thalidomide babies? Remember Fen-Phen? remember the problems with meat, chicken, poultry, and spinach. Food Safety and Inspection Service, it makes cuts of $88 million below the 2010 funding levels and $107 million below the administration's 2011 budget request. The National Institute of Health cuts appropriations for the NIH by $1.6 billion below FY 2010 and $2.5 billion below the President's budget. You know, the National Institute of Health, they're trying to find cures for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and diabetes and cancer. Oh, let's cut them by $1.6 billion. Clean drinking water, the Republican bill slashes the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund by 56%. EPA, the bill includes an undesignated $300 million rescission to EPA. Medicare cuts appropriations for the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services by $458 million below fiscal year 2010 and $634 million below the President's budget request. However, what they fail to consider are the benefits associated with these costs, many of which generally exceed the cost. And by failing to consider money saved, the Republicans are increasing the deficit and increasing costs. Nowhere is this failure in fiscal policy more apparent than when it comes to the physical health of the American people. The Republican continuing resolution would increase the deficit dramatically as a result of unseen health care costs associated with the degradation of the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. Now, the physical impact of the Republican cuts. The FDA, $241 million. This is to undo an historic improvement and it reduces food safety by $241 million. In the United States, an estimated 76 million people get sick each year with foodborne illnesses, and 5,000 die, according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention. All of the medical costs and economic losses associated with foodborne illnesses add up to a staggering price of $152 billion, says the Pew Charitable Trust. By slashing funding from the FDA's food safety programs, more and more people will get sick, and $152 billion annual price tag is going to climb even higher. That doesn't sound like a responsible fiscal or fiscal policy to me. Clean water, although more than 70% of the earth is covered in water, only about 1% of all the water on the planet is safe to drink. H.R. 1 will reduce that 1% by allowing major corporations and developers to pump toxins into our water and by failing to invest in the necessary infrastructure to maintain, treat, deliverable, safe drinking water. It reduces the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund by 56%, a program that leverages significant private finances by providing low and no-interest loans to states to fund drinking water infrastructure improvement programs. Leaking pipes and deteriorating mains lead to costly bacteria contamination and cause chronic health problems to thousands of Americans. They create As you can see, the physical health of our nation is being threatened as well, and not just the fiscal health. We need to be concerned about the physical health of our children and be concerned about how the long-term effects of this will be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California. You want to be next? From California?
Speaker, week before last, just before we adjourned, we got the sad news of the passing of our good friend and former colleague, Congressman Steve Horn. Steve Horn was, without a doubt, one of the most intelligent and accomplished members to ever serve in this body. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, he was one of the kindest and most decent members. He got his bachelor's degree from Stanford University, his master's from Harvard, and went back and got his Ph.D. at Stanford University. He served in strategic intelligence in the early 1950s in the U.S. Army Reserve, and then he got involved in public service in a big way. He served in the Eisenhower administration, and he went on to become a legislative assistant to California Senator Tom Kuechel. From that point forward, he had dedicated himself to public service, and he expanded that greatly. He got into education, and for nearly 2 decades, from 1970 to 1988, he served as president of the California State University at Long Beach, and during that period of time, he was named one of the 100 most effective college presidents in the country. Mr. Speaker, then he joined us here as a member of Congress serving for 5 terms. And he was an individual who spent a great deal of time and effort focusing on issues. In fact, one of the great stories about Steve Horn that I heard from his former staff member, who I'm happy to say when he left came to work for me, Elisa Doe, who is his legislative assistant, now my legislative director. She told me of how they would often be looking for Congressman Horn. There were votes taking place here in the House, and he was over in the Library of Congress. Didn't have a pager with him. We didn't have BlackBerries at the time. He didn't have a pager with him, and yet he was over there in the library studying, trying to get more and more information and develop his knowledge. He also was someone who never hesitated to go against the grain. He served on the Government Operations Committee. Government reform was a priority for him, and transportation. He represented the Long Beach area, and he understood that 40% of the goods going to and from the consumers and workers of the United States go through the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and he was always dedicated to ensuring that that was a very high priority. And he had this great focus on reforming and improving the operations of the federal government. Mr. Speaker, he was an institutionalist. He loved this body, understanding that the deliberative nature of service here and of our work is very important and can't be forgotten. Steve leaves his wonderful wife, Nene. They were married for 57 years, 2 children, 1 grandchild, and I've got to say that I miss his advice, counsel, and friendship and camaraderie. And I'd like to, in the spirit of bipartisanship, yield to my friend from Manhattan, Ms. Maloney, who joins me, served with him on the Government Reform Committee.
I thank the gentleman, and I rise in tribute to Representative Steve Horn. He was a thoughtful, dedicated, honorable man who built his record on bipartisan cooperation and commitment to good government. He was a legislator's legislator. He was deeply committed to doing the right thing, writing the right bill, getting it passed, and he was also a very good friend of mine. He came with his wife, Nene, and visited me at my home in New York. I went to visit him in his district, a district that he loved and was totally dedicated to. During his 10 years of service here in the House of Representatives, we worked together on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He chaired the Subcommittee on Government Management, Information and Technology for 6 years, and I was the ranking member with him. So not only was he dedicated to running government better, saving taxpayers money, but also legislated and passed many important bills. He helped me pass a bill that I authored, the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which we worked on together for roughly 7 years. It took us that long to pass it, and a book has been written about that process and the bill and what it has done to help in problem solving now as we confront delicate issues going forward. The first hearing on the Debbie Smith bill, which has been called the most important anti-rape bill in the history of our country, was in his committee, where Debbie Smith testified about her rape, the fact that no one was reacting to it. And this whole effort, including that hearing that he chaired, was made into a movie called A Life Interrupted, and how DNA has been used to put rapists behind bars. He was a dedicated, wonderful person. He also chaired the Arts Caucus and worked hard for its funding. And in a time when we talk about bipartisanship, Steve Horn was the real deal, a bipartisan problem solver. He wanted to get the problem solved. He wanted to help this country, help his community. He was devoted to his wife and 2 children and grandchild. I yield back to my distinguished colleague. He was just a great guy.
I thank my friend for a very thoughtful contribution. Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that our thoughts and prayers are with Nene and their wonderful family, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts, the chair recognizes Mr. McGovern, recognized for The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for the yielding. Mr. Speaker, at the end of January, the United Nations reported that the cost of basic food commodities, basic grains, vegetable oils, sugar, were at their highest levels since the UN created this index in 1990. 2 weeks ago, World Bank President Robert Zoellick announced that the bank's food price index shows food prices are now 29% higher than they were a year ago. Zoellick warned the G20 to put food first when they next meet. The World Bank estimates that these recent food price spikes have pushed about 44 million people into extreme poverty. That's under $1.25 a day. This is a global security crisis. The lack of food security contributes to political instability. Food was the primary reason people first took to the streets in Tunisia. Food and poverty were right at the top of the list in the squares of Egypt, right next to the call for political freedom. In 2007 to 2008, the last global food crisis, there were major food riots in nearly 40 countries. In May 2008, my fellow co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, Congresswoman Joanne Emerson, and I were briefed by the GAO about the lack of coordination and continuity in U.S. food and development programs. We started calling for a comprehensive approach to address global hunger and food insecurity. Now, thanks in large part to the efforts and leadership of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and USAID Director Raj Shah, the U.S. government responded to that call and over a 2-year period of time initiated a comprehensive government-wide approach to reduce global hunger and increase nutrition and food security. Not because it feels good, not even because it's the right and moral thing to do, but because it's in our national security and economic interest to make countries food secure, more productive, healthier, and more stable. This strategy is known as the Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative. It includes our bilateral programs and efforts with other governments and multilateral institutions. To be successful, everyone has to pitch in. Feed the Future is the signature program of the U.S. strategy. It works with small farmers and governments to increase agricultural production and strengthen local and regional markets in order to reduce hunger and grow economies. Other key elements include the McGovern-Dole Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program that brings kids to school and keeps them there by making sure that they get at least one nutritious meal each day at school. This program has proven to be especially effective in convincing families to send their daughters to school. And finally, there is our Food for Peace program, which provides food to millions of women, children, and men caught in life-threatening situations brought on by natural disasters, war, and internal conflict. This program provides U.S.-grown commodities and locally purchased foods that literally keep people trying to survive in the world's most dangerous situations alive. Mr. Speaker, I've never heard anyone say that they would like to see more hunger in the world, that they would like to see children too weak from hunger to be able to learn, or young girls forced to work long hours because they no longer are being fed at school. But that's exactly what the budget cuts that passed the House 1 week ago would do. The House cut $800 million out of the food aid budget and over 40% from the development assistance, which is where Feed the Future is funded. If these short-sighted and, quite frankly, callous cuts are allowed to stand, we would literally be taking the food out of the mouths of over 2 million children. We would be depriving over 18 million people the food that keeps them alive in Haiti, Darfur, Afghanistan, Guatemala, Ethiopia, Kenya, and elsewhere. We would be turning our backs on countries where we made commitments to help boost the production of their own small farmers so that they could finally free themselves of having to depend on U.S. and international food aid to feed their own people. Enough, Mr. Speaker, enough. This isn't a question of charity. It's an issue of national security, of what happens when desperate people can't find or afford food, and the anger that comes from people who see no future for their children except poverty and death. I asked President Obama to stand up for his programs and fight for them. I asked the White House to hold a global summit on hunger, nutrition, and food security. I asked the media to wake up and grasp the consequences of these short-sighted cuts. And I asked my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to fund these programs so that they could be successful. It really is a matter of life and death. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Last week, Secretary of Defense Gates spoke at West Point, and I'd like to quote one comment from his speech. In my opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the President to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined. As General MacArthur said so delicately, put it years ago. Again, this is Secretary Gates. I have great respect for Secretary Gates. I think he is one of the true outstanding Secretary of Defenses this country has ever had. Mr. Speaker, the reason I'm here today, I bring a photograph of a flag-draped coffin. It's called a transfer case being escorted off a plane at Dover Air Force Base. Mr. Speaker, it is time to bring our troops home. They have been in Afghanistan for over 10 years. I would also say it is time that this Congress meet its constitutional responsibility to debate war and whether we should be there or bring our troops home. In recent weeks, I was very concerned to hear our government and military leaders saying that it could be 2014 before we start significantly downsizing our troops in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, that brings to my mind trips to Walter Reed and Bethesda. So I will ask this question. How many more young men and women must lose their legs, their lives for a corrupt government that history has proven will never be changed? Why should they be dying and losing their legs for Karzai, who doesn't even know that we're his friends? It makes no sense. I will quote a highly decorated retired military general who has been advising me on Afghanistan for the past year. And I quote this general, "What is the end state we are looking to achieve? What are the measures of effectiveness? What is our exit strategy? Same old questions, no answers. What do we say to the mother and father, the wife of the last soldier or Marine killed to support a corrupt government and corrupt leaders in a war that cannot be won?" Mr. Speaker, these are words from a general that fought in Vietnam for this country, that reached the highest he could in the branch of service where he served. Mr. Speaker, as you know, I represent the 3rd District of North Carolina, the home of Camp Lejeune Marine Base. And recently I was with a Marine who has served this nation for years. He shares my concern about getting out of Afghanistan. So I asked this Marine if he would write me a letter. And this is what he wrote. "Congressman Jones, I'm writing this letter to express my concern over the current Afghanistan war. I'm a retired Marine officer with 31+ years of active duty. I retired in 2004 due to service limitations, or I am sure I would have been on my 3rd or 4th deployment by now to a war that has gone on for too long." I'll go to the end, Mr. Speaker, of his letter to me. "The Afghan war has no end state to it. I urge you to make contact with all the current and newly elected members of Congress and ask them to end this war and bring our young men and women home. If any of my comments will assist you in this effort, you are welcome to use them and my name." His name is Dennis G. Adams, Lieutenant Colonel, retired, United States Marine Corps. Mr. Speaker, before I close, I want to remind those on the floor of the House today that I hope if you haven't had the chance that you will go to Walter Reed and Bethesda to see the young men and women that will never walk again, to see the young men and women that maybe will not ever think properly again because of PTSD and TBI. And I want to remember the young soldier, 22 years old, private, United States Army, who before I walked in the room, the escort, Major Mack, said to me, "This soldier has no body parts below his waist. They've all been blown away." So, Mr. Speaker, it's time for the Congress to meet its responsibility and demand a debate on the floor of the House about bringing our troops home from Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, in closing, as I always do, as I look at this beautiful photograph of a soldier who gave his life for this country and the escort team, God, please bless our men and women in uniform. God, please bless the families of our men and women in uniform. God, please hold in your loving arms the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. God, bless the House and Senate that we will do what is right in your eyes for today's generation and tomorrow's generation. I ask God to give wisdom, strength, and courage to President Obama that he will do what is right in the eyes of God. And 3 times I will ask, God, please, God, please, God, please continue to bless America. I yield back.
Chair recognizes a gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to congratulate the gentleman from North Carolina for the remarks he just made. He's a Republican and I'm a Democrat, but I will tell you this. We are friends and we work together. And he is one of the most conscientious members of this House who follows his conscience and his moral values in making decisions. He gave a very moving and important speech on the floor today. Thank the gentleman, Mr. Jones from North Carolina. Mr. Speaker, when I come to the floor to speak about our country's recent fiscal history, I'm often told there's no point in looking back. But Majority Leader Cantor got it entirely right when he wrote this: "The future will not be won by repeating the mistakes of the past." The future will not be won by repeating the mistakes of the past. Unfortunately, however, we are proceeding on a path that shows little inclination to live by those words. Once again, our Republican colleagues are using the language of fiscal responsibility, but pursuing policies of fiscal irresponsibility. Our colleagues across the aisle trumpet the $100 billion in domestic discretionary spending they voted to cut from our budget. However, their actions belie those words. Their very first action in this new Congress was to approve policies, a rule package, that would provide for borrowing an additional $5 trillion, unpaid for. Their budget policy would give us the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, they failed to take on the real fiscal challenges. And very frankly, there is blame to share across this chamber, Republicans and Democrats, for failing to take on those challenges. But the policies they're pursuing would even make our situation worse. On the other hand, the cuts they do make are taken out of vital investments that would grow our economy and create jobs. As I will mention later on, some 700 to 800,000 jobs over the next 18 months, it is projected, would be cost by the adoption of their policies. This combination is not new. It is a repeat of Republican fiscal policy in the past. Let's look at the evidence. First of all, on deficits. What this chart shows is everything below this line is a deficit. Everything above this line is a surplus. Obviously, what you want is the deficit going down into surplus. What you don't want is going from surplus into deficit. You will notice that the Reagan administration and Reagan-Bush are noted in this first red quadrant, or yes, quadrant, and the Clinton administration going from deep debt to surplus, then the Bush administration going from surplus into deep debt, and the Obama administration trying to get out of the extraordinarily tanking, receding economic status, invested in bringing us out, and now we see us coming out. It shows how the fiscally responsible policies adopted under President Clinton took us into surplus. It unfortunately shows that when we reversed those policies in 2001, we then went back into deep deficits. We all know how those predictions that Republicans made when we adopted this economic program, for which none of the Republicans in the House or the Senate voted for. They said economic catastrophe would occur. That was their analysis. That was their economic prediction. In fact, exactly the opposite happened, and we created 22 million new jobs for Americans. This deficit chart also shows how our record surplus was squandered during the Bush administration. The second chart I want to show you talks about government spending. We have to cut spending. We all know that. We all talk about it. But let's look at who actually did cut government spending. Again, government spending was up and down, but at a rate higher than it was under the Clinton administration, where spending as a percentage of our gross domestic product was almost, without exception, went down. So when we talk about spending, we have a record of restraining and cutting spending. In fact, that was a partnership, frankly, because Republicans agreed to make compromises with the Democratic president. However, when they controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate, you will see that spending went up sharply once again. Again, we see government spending as a percentage of the economy rising under President Bush, and after the emergency measures needed to respond to the recession, starting to come down after the recession was ameliorated. Real median wages. I want to show this chart as well, because after all, these are nice statistics, but what does it do for people? What is the impact on them? Real median wages sort of stuck. And I'll end with this and complete my rest of my statement later, Mr. Speaker. But you will see that median wages under the President Clinton's administration went up, and then they were flat. And they are going up again now under President Obama. Too slowly, to be sure. Mr. Speaker, I will continue these remarks because if we do not learn from the past, if we repeat the failed policies of yesterday, our people will not be well served. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Quayle. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, a little more than a week ago, this House passed a continuing resolution with $100 billion in spending cuts. Not only was this an important step towards reining in our nation's paralyzing deficits, it also sent a clear signal to job creators that House Republicans are determined to foster an economic environment where certainty and confidence can return to the marketplace. When a young family looks for a new neighborhood, they examine a variety of factors. They might ask about how safe it is. They might want to know about the school system or whether their neighbors are friendly. The broader question being, what is the environment like? Job creators take a similar approach when they decide whether it's safe to invest capital, expand their businesses, and hire new workers in America. Just as a family is not going to choose a neighborhood with overflowing sewers and high crime rate, a business owner is not going to expand and invest in an economic environment marred by debt-fueled uncertainty that will increase the cost to run their business. After all, deficits are just deferred tax payments that eventually come due. We must ensure that America is the most attractive and safest place to start a business, take risks, and invest capital. It is essential that we send a clear signal to American businesses that both parties are committed to removing the barriers to job growth and economic development. Republicans believe, and I would argue many of the American public believes, that cutting spending is a crucial step in that process. Yesterday, Mark Zandi released a study which argued that Republican spending cut plan would cost jobs. I'm sure Mr. Zandi is a nice enough person, but in recent years, he hasn't seen a spending increase he didn't like. He was the Democrats' go-to guy when they were looking for an economist to endorse the stimulus. And he even endorsed a second stimulus package after the initial $1 trillion package was signed into law. So before my Democrat colleagues start touting Mr. Zandi's report, I suggest they look at his record on the so-called stimulus. By merely debating spending cuts for the past few weeks, this body engaged in a process that many feared was obsolete. Some have said Republicans are trying to cut too much. Others, that we're not cutting enough. And indeed, we still have a long way to go to get our deficits and debt under control. But what no one can dispute, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that we are serious about cutting spending. In addition to the $100 billion in cuts Republicans have offered over the next year, we have also made clear that our upcoming budget will include serious, common-sense entitlement reforms. All of these efforts have one goal in mind: producing an environment conducive to economic growth and job creation. House Republicans are doing what we are sent here to do, and that's precisely what our job creators need: clarity and decisive leadership from their government, not mixed messages and delayed action. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio. Ms. Capter, you're recognized. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across the world, we witness millions of ordinary people rising up in public assemblies, many at risk to their own lives, speaking out for a better life for all. From Madison to Misrata, from Cairo to Columbus, courageous people are taking a stand for justice for the many, not just the few. Another giant rally is planned today in Columbus, Ohio, where the Republican governor, John Kasich, the son of public workers, is systematically attacking the hard-earned collective bargaining rights of our state public workers, policemen, firefighters, teachers, and other public sector workers. He even called an Ohio policeman an idiot and was forced to apologize. That is his priority, not job creation, not education, not economic development, but attacking workers. That is why thousands of people will converge on the state's capitol again today to call him out on his extreme right-wing agenda. The public outcry started in Wisconsin, given its long history of progressivism. Americans have begun to rise up to prevent more harm being done to our way of life, more attacks on our jobs, more threats to our standard of living, of our middle class, more cuts in wages and benefits of hardworking families. The movement is spreading, just as the democracy movement is spreading across northern Africa and the Middle East. Just as we watch freedom rising in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and beyond, we watch the spectacle of America's governors trying to dictate to citizens who earn on average $24,000 and aren't even eligible for Social Security, but receive about $900 a month in average public employee retirement benefits, that they should sacrifice even more to balance state budgets. No, they don't deserve to be made scapegoats for their state's budget problems. And they don't deserve to be put on the front lines of the battle to save workers' rights. But they're there nonetheless, and they deserve our support. We are all Wisconsinites. We are all Buckeyes. We are all Hoosiers. We have to stand together united for the America for all that we want. If John Kasich wants to look for scapegoats, perhaps he should draw upon his experience with Lehman Brothers. Maybe he should look into his Rolodex for some of his cronies from Wall Street who helped bankroll his campaign. Because the real culprits who have caused the deep economic harm to our nation are watching gleefully on the sidelines as our friends and neighbors try to protect their livelihoods. Wall Street's greed caused the financial crisis. That greed triggered lower state and local revenues with the devaluation of housing and rampant foreclosures. Yet the Wall Street titans who stole our home equity, our annuities, our pension accounts remain scot-free of any real attention or prosecution. I have a message to our governors. Blame Wall Street, not Main Street. When 6 mega banks control 2/3 of the banking system of our country, when corporate profits are at record highs, yet ordinary workers are being asked to empty their pockets to balance state budgets, something's really out of kilter in America. When GE and Exxon don't pay taxes and Wall Street executives walk away with huge bonuses and foreclosures increase, what's seriously out of balance in America is the distribution of political power in this country. In Ohio, the brothers and sisters of the heroes of 9/11, our firefighters and police, are being asked to give away their rights as free American citizens at the bargaining table for wages and benefits. Our governor wants to abolish middle-class prevailing wages. Same in Wisconsin. Any nation that loses labor rights loses democracy. What's at stake in our nation is more than wages. What's at stake is liberty for all and opportunity for all. Governor Walker, it wasn't the firefighters in Madison that robbed Main Street and stole our home equity. You might ask your friends, the Koch brothers, about that. Governor Kasich, it wasn't the teachers in Ohio who financed the shipping of our jobs offshore through NAFTA. You voted for it, and your buddies on Wall Street rammed it through Congress. And Governor Daniels, it wasn't your public sector workers that created the biggest financial bubble in U.S. history and then jumped ship when it burst, letting everyone else go down. That was created by the policies of George Bush, where you served as director of the OMB while the federal budget deficit exploded. I salute America's workers who are fighting for the middle class and our way of life. The whole world is watching. After they win their battles in Madison, in Columbus, in Indianapolis, I hope they take the fight to Wall Street and get our money back. That's who has it. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the border war continues and there is no end in sight. And this week, President Calderon of Mexico is coming back to Washington, D.C. He's going to meet with our president. It'll be interesting to see if he continues to blame America for his problems. You remember the last time he was here, he stood here in the House floor and dressed us down as the United States members of the House of Representatives, blaming us for his problems. Blaming us for the corruption, blaming us for the drugs that are in Mexico, blaming us for the violence in Mexico, blaming the folks in Arizona for trying to protect their own border. I wonder if he will continue the blame game. The problem is the situation is worse not only on the border, but in Mexico. Corruption along the border with Mexican law enforcement continues, even though that the Mexican military is doing a fairly good job of reining in the drug cartels. And he blames the United States for the guns that are in Mexico. You must remember, Mr. Speaker, just some of the guns that go to Mexico are from the United States. Guns from all over the world end up in Mexico. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of those is Mexico doesn't protect its borders any better than we do. People throughout the world know if you can get to Mexico by any means, whether you want to bring contraband, drugs, guns, or people, you can eventually get into the United States. Because Mexico, like the United States, doesn't have operational control of the mutual border between the United States. Even the General Accounting Office, those are the people who keep up with statistics, and they have made this report recently that on the United States border with Mexico, only 44% of the border is under the control of the United States, and only 15% is airtight. So who controls the other 56% of the U.S. border with Mexico? If it's not the United States, it's not Mexico. Who controls it? We don't know. Probably the outlaws, the drug cartels. They are the ones that have operational control of both sides of the border because the situation on the border continues to get worse. Mexico doesn't protect its border from people going into Mexico from any direction. And the United States doesn't protect its border adequately to keep drugs and violence from coming into the United States. Unfortunately, this is continuing to get worse. Last year,